Welcome to the Pawn Sacrifice channel, and a little bit more wiring. We're almost done on this. This is the coil conversion. This is kind of a separate video from the last one because it's a bit more in depth. Essentially going from the old 1.8T coils that we've got here to these nice shiny new ones from the 2 litre, although these are R8 coils. And then also I'll cover off one of the problems that I had, essentially this. And if you're having a problem where you've done the conversion and it's not worked, I may have a solution for you, but we'll come back to that. I'm going to be going through the wiring diagrams, so what the kind of standard factory configuration is and what that looks like, what the kit looks like if you do the components that I've got for the conversion, how they should work, and then essentially how I've done this for this car. The one thing I would say is don't rely on my documentation. Basically check everything for yourself, get a multimeter, go through, check the wires, see where everything goes, and just make sure you're doing it correctly for the diagrams, because there's a few differences between different models as I've been finding out as we've gone along. And so yes, we're going to start off by having a look at the wiring limb for the loom, or this is the coil end of it. I've got a picture here which kind of annotates and explains it a little better. So we've obviously got the coil connectors. There's a ground on here which goes to the valve cover, and then out of the back of it you've got the trigger or signal cables, and then also the power cables as well. And I'll explain more of this when we get into the wiring diagrams. But yeah, essentially that's relatively straightforward. The bit down the bottom there is the Icm module, and that's the thing that we're looking to delete. So just to explain a little bit more about that, here's another picture. So with the Icm module, essentially don't take too much into my diagrams because I don't know that much about transistors, but essentially there's transistors inside this block. What it does is it takes the trigger signal coming in, you've got a ground coming in, and then it just sends one signal out, which actually is the trigger. I think that's basically just amplifying the signal that's coming through there, although I'm not entirely sure. I have been through, so here it is, I have been through this with a multimeter and just set it to the diode testing and gone through, and it is essentially a straight connection through, but we'll come back to that. So next we'll have a look at the coils. So this is what we're looking, essentially what we're going from and to side by side, so you can see some of the differences here. So first of all is the height difference. So on the left we've got the black coil, which is the original one, and then the red one. This is the red one, it's from the R8. Essentially you get black versions of these as well. They're from the 2 litre. I think they're exactly the same. There's no performance benefit from the R8 ones other than the fancy colour. But essentially you can see the height difference in them here, so obviously we need to account for that because it's going to be sticking out over the top of the valve cover. And the other thing as well is, I'm not sure whether you've noticed it, but essentially the black, the original one, is 3-pin, and then we've got 4-pin on the new one. And again, we'll come back and explain all of that and what the differences are there and how we go about converting them. So next up is the conversion kit. This is the ECS Tuning. I bought this from Awesome GTI, which is I think the UK distributor for them, and essentially this is the set of coils. So you just pick which ones you want. There's then the riser plate bar thing that comes in with it, and again there's options on finishes and colours, and essentially all that does is increase the height at which the coil sits, essentially to neutralise the difference in the height for those. That works. Hopefully this is going to be okay because there's no tie down on them. You can get other riser plates that have some sort of tie down for the coils to stop them popping off, but hopefully that won't be an issue. The hose that you can see in there that's just a little vacuum hose. I'm not sure what it's for because it's not really relevant to this particular engine, but that is, I think, if you need to relocate something that's on there that gets in the way of however this conversion is being done. Next up is the Icm Deletes Loom. I bought this off of eBay. This is from Jack Spanier Racing, and essentially there's two parts of this. There's the loom itself, which is essentially a Deutsch connector, which goes down to the coil pack connectors. These are obviously the right types of the 4-pin, and then it's also got the valve cover connector. There's the other half of the Deutsch connector on there, and the pins that you need to connect stuff up, which we'll see in the diagrams in a moment. And the other thing that's in there is, which you can see on the diagram, is that which is just a little straight through connector to replace the ICM, and essentially this is taking through the trigger signals. So there's actually no fifth connector, so there's the 4 signal cables, for one for each cylinder or one for each coil, but the ground is missing there, so nothing's passed through on that. So that's also in there as well. Assuming I've set this up properly, what you'll be able to see down here now is the wiring diagram that I've put together for the factory loom, and this, rather than just taking a copy of the Haynes manual wiring diagram and putting that on screen, I'm not sure what would happen with copyright for that, but also it doesn't quite show how the wires are laid out. Essentially what you've got left to right, you've got the connector there that goes on to the ECU, and you can see the 4 trigger signals coming out. I've also put on there on pin 1 just to show where the power cable goes in. That's the switch power that goes into the ECU, which, if you follow that up, that's then shared with the power that goes to the coils. And essentially the way that this works inside the loom is you've got the 4 cables coming in from one side, and then there's for the coils, then you've got one for the power, and then essentially you just have another one which comes in from the relay, and those are just bunched together. And actually, when I strip the loom down, essentially there's a crimp-on type connector which goes over those, and then protection over the top of that, and it's just done that way inside the loom. So that's essentially how that works. You've got the 4 trigger signals which go into the ICM. You've also there got the ground that I mentioned coming in, and that's essentially the ground wire that comes out of the main loom. So that goes through. The ICM does its thing, and then it puts out 4 cables, essentially the trigger signals, which then go to the coils. What you'll see on there is the pin numbers that I've got. They look a bit odd on the standard factory ones, but essentially the pin numbers relate to what you will actually see on the top, if you look at the top of the connector. So you've got, so what have we done? Those, and then there's the ground that comes in from the loom, from the valve cover. And essentially the way that this works is a bit weird, because it essentially goes all the way down from the valve cover, all the way down inside, and then all the way back up again. So it gets down to the furthest point, and then it just kind of hops from one to the next to the next to the next, and that's essentially how that all works. So it's relatively straightforward. The slight complication is the Icm module. These things do fail. They're not the most reliable, as I understand it. I'm not sure about the reliability of the cores, but we want to about getting rid of that. So let's next get rid of that one. Almost made it through this stint and then got interrupted by a helicopter and have to start again. So where was I? We were talking about the kits, so essentially the delete kits and how they work. So we know the coils there over on the right, but starting again from the left hand side, what you'll see as you come across immediately is that the ICM has been deleted and replaced by this little thing which I mentioned earlier. So essentially that's just taking the cables through as they are. You literally just unplug either side here and then plug the connectors into that little delete tube, which is all very nice and neat. You then have the signal cables, and you need to remove these from the loom here. So similarly for the power signal, so where you've got across the top, you've got the power signal coming in, or the shared power coming in across the relay at the top. What you need to do is find a place on the loom and just basically work out where it is you need to attach these to the Deutsch connector, run something up or strip this section of the loom back, and then essentially go through and cut the wires. You need to pay attention to the color coding on the trigger wires because they are specific to the location, so where they go in for into the Deutsch connector 1, 2, 3, 4 relates to the coils that they then go to. The shared power, that doesn't matter, you can do whatever you want with those as long as it goes into the right section. So it's 8 through 12, they're 9 through 12, sorry, they're it's shared power, so you don't actually need to worry about those going in any specific order, just chuck them in and away you go. And then the other bit that we need to come back to is the second earth. So there's two earths, so you've got one earth on the valve cover, and then you've got another earth which is separate to that. The reason there's two of them, and don't go wiring them up to the same one for ease, because you could just take the valve cover ground and then share that across the signal ground as well. But with the valve cover ground, that's for essentially the spark that's being created, and that can get quite noisy, so you want to keep the two separate. What I've done with mine is essentially just run it off a separate grounding point on the engine. What you could potentially do is go back to where we've removed the ICM and unplug that so that the ground signal is the one in the middle. You could potentially de-pin that from the original connector and use that instead. All I've done is similar to what VW Audi have done with their cables, is I've just run the ground cable up towards where the Deutsch connector is, stripped wires from each end. I think I've got a butt connector or something like that, and just crimped the wires together, put probably some electrical tape, and then shrink wrap over the top of that, and that's essentially what they've done out of the factory, so that's good enough for me. And then the ground cables go in 5, 6, 7, 8 on there, and similar to the power, it doesn't matter where you put them. And yeah, essentially when you've done that, you just plug everything in and fire it up, and away you go, and hopefully it works. If it doesn't work, we'll come back to that. Mine didn't, although the method which I did it was slightly differently. Doing it with this method, essentially the advantage is that you're keeping it nice and neat, because you're just taking this out, replacing it with that, all the connectors there, everything plugs in nice and neatly, and away you go in theory. Double check your wiring colours and everything that you've got. Check the instructions for, I think it's called the 034 repair loom, so have a look at that, and just double check all of those. Check the cables down to where they're going on the coil connectors as well, and hopefully you won't go too far wrong. Okay, now we're on to the final stint, which is the Porsche conversion. This is probably what you're most likely to do if you were doing this yourself, and actually doing the conversion and building this up. You would probably still need to buy the coil riser or some form of coil riser, but you can get the connector plugs. You can buy those on eBay. I think if you get them, they'll just get one that comes with the pins, and essentially you can do this yourself. I would recommend using Deutsch connectors for this, just because they're really easy to use and they're really easy to de-pin as well. So if you have got any problems, you can just open the connector up, take out the the protective end of it, and then just push a little clip down inside and slide the connector out. It's really straightforward. I may have a clip of that in a little bit. So what we're doing with the AEB conversion and where this is slightly different, starting at the top left, what is slightly different is we've still got a relay that goes through for the switch power. I'm not sending that down to the ECU. I've taken the ECU power off, but we won't worry about that now. So yeah, you've got a switch power that comes off of a relay, so that comes on when you start the car up. What is slightly different is on the ICM side of it, where I've deleted the ICM, I've not actually replaced it with anything. So this essentially is the cables that I've taken, and why that's still intact there is I've still got I've basically cut the cables, so the colours you'll see for the cables are slightly different, and that's that reason. Everything follows through in order, so pin 1 goes to pin 1, so you just essentially take it back a section, if that makes any sense. So you're just using the previous colour. They go in exactly the same point, or so I thought, on the Deutsch connector. The ground, everything else goes in as it was, and yeah, that's it. In theory, it's relatively straightforward. The main difference here is where you're getting the power from isn't just off of the plug that's already there. You need to find a power feed for that, and yeah, you're just essentially removing the ICM altogether and terminating the cables before that. For this engine, there's loads of room. If you've stripped back the loom itself, there's loads of space for that, so you don't need to worry about that at all. Yeah, and that's it, and it should be relatively straightforward, except for this car it wasn't. And it was a bit weird because when I tried to start the engine, this happened, and I couldn't figure out what it was. I went through and did all of the troubleshooting that I could, and I couldn't find out what was wrong. The engine had been running beforehand. That was something I should have mentioned up top. The best thing you can do with this is just make sure the car's working fine before you do anything, because you then know that if it doesn't work, you're chasing down a problem with the coil conversion, rather than potentially another fault with the engine which had stopped it from working in the first place. And yeah, what was weird was I went round, started unplugging the connectors because from the various different sensors, because that's something I'd heard to do. I knew that the timing was right because the engine had run before, and I knew that I was getting spark previously, although I did double check that, and I knew that everything on the fueling side of it was working as well, and obviously it was getting air through. So yeah, so I just went round, started unplugging connectors because I couldn't quite figure out what was going on, and when I unplugged the cam position sensor and tried to start it, it started. And it started and ran first time. I switched off, thought I'd done something, plugged the connector back in, and it didn't work. I ordered a new one of these up, replaced it, thought, yep, brilliant, now we're going to be in business, and it basically went back to not starting in. I think I can only assume that disconnecting it essentially runs it on, because it doesn't know where the cam is, almost runs it on a wasted spark mode where it's sending down multiple signals at the same time, firing different plugs, and you know, one of them's in the right position at the right time, and the other one just goes unspent. So replace that, and that didn't work. I did some more looking around on the internet, and this is the weird thing. Then go and reverse the order of the coils, and with the cam sensor plugged in, it starts. So for whatever reason, this works back to front. So reversing the order of the coils has now fixed the problem, and it works absolutely fine. It actually runs better than it did when I had it running previously on the original coils. So that's quite satisfying. The reason that I mentioned having the torch connector is it was very easy to just go in and unpin that, and all I did was go back in, essentially pull one pin out. So I did it 2 at a time. So I pulled out pin 1 and pin 4 and swapped those over, and then did 2 and 3 and swapped those over, just to make it easier so that I didn't get lost in what I was doing. But yeah, it's really straightforward. You just push the little clip down which inside the connector, which then allows you to pull the cables out, and there's enough room to swap those over. So went through, did that, and it's absolutely running fine. So if you've got a problem where you've done the conversion and it's not running, then I would recommend, first of all, unplug the cam position sensor, which is on the hopefully if you're doing this you'll know what the cam position sensor is, but it's on the front of the engine, obviously the front of the cam. So if you look at direct line in front of the oil filler, and it's just basically plugged in there. If you unplug that and it starts, chances are the coils are in the wrong order. You need to repin it really, because if you don't go through and repin it, it just ends up with all the cables in a mess because they're the wrong side. I can't find any logic in this, having had a look online, having looked through all the documentation, having traced everything through. The only thing that I can think, because there aren't a lot of people complaining about this exact same problem, is that there's a difference in the firing order or in the coil order of what comes out, different between the longitudinal engines, which this is, and there's only about 2 or 3 different longitudinal ones, versus the transverse ones, which is far more common. So I think there is a slight difference in where coil 1 sits in relation to the cylinder. That's the only logic that I can make of this, because it doesn't make any sense that I've just swapped that round and it's just worked. Thankfully it is sorted and it is running, and it's running very nicely. And just kind of wrapping this up, if I was going to do this again, would I make the loom up myself? Quite possibly. It just seemed a bit more daunting. The loom that I bought, or the conversion kit, I got from the US. I think it was about $60 or $70, which is actually a pretty good price because the Deutsch connectors aren't cheap. And actually they made this little conversion thingy, so if you need one of those, it's probably best to just buy the kit. So yeah, no, really happy with that. Once everything was set, I then went back and just re-loomed everything up to the connectors to make sure that that was all right. So yeah, that's it really. Relatively straightforward. I think the main thing is, although I've gone into quite depth here, probably more than you think, it really does pay to know how these things work, factory, stock, and how they work when you've changed them. Understand what wires do which and what's supposed to go where. Test all the connections and everything as you go. So the power, just make sure the grounds are both got good connections there. And yeah, you shouldn't have too many problems. So hopefully that's helped. And yeah, by all means refer to my wiring diagrams that I've put up, but in terms of the actual colours themselves, I would probably just double check exactly what's on your loom. Possibly even, if you can, check the pins back to the ECU to see exactly what's coming where. But yeah, as usual, thanks for watching, and hopefully catch you soon when we look at converting a tacho to a 5-volt signal. Thanks very much. Bye now.